I'll say if you're new to the Page Field Configurator, it's a configuration-based tool that lets you customize classic and fluid pages without using App Designer. This is a functional tool, so if you know how to use Control-J to find component and mark it, and the Inspect Element tool in your browser, then you should be good to go. You can find Page Field Configurator in the Enterprise Components menu if you have the system requirements listed here on the slide. There's a delivered permission list for the page, and you can go ahead and add that to your back office administrative role if you haven't done that already. Thank you so much for muting. If you're not already on mute, if you could please mute at this time. We're not going to go into too many details about how to use this process, but here's a general overview. Use the Inspect tool to find the record field you want to adjust on the page. Use the Control-J to find the component and mark it. Navigate to the Page Field Configurator page in the PIA. Enter your optional criteria, and then add the fields that you want to adjust, and then make the field adjustments needed for each field. You can add an optional restricted user list or other criteria, and then map all of your changes to the portal registry. And that's generally it. There's a few more words on this slide to give some more detail, but if you don't already know how to use the tool, there are other sessions that go into much greater detail than we will here. So there are some really good demos out there to show you how a step-by-step in more detail, but what we want to do today is to give you a better idea of how to decide whether Page Field Configurator is the right tool for your project. So we're going to talk about an example of a relatively complex business problem and how Page Field Configurator, how the solution actually turned out. So we'll talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. One thing to note about here is you are going to see an example that came out of Campus Solutions, but Campus Solutions tends to be a pretty complex iteration of PeopleSoft. So what I hope that you can learn is that if we can do it with an example like this in Campus Solutions, then it's worth a look for your organization. So the business problem was that a large university let its department users update the very complex course catalog and schedule of classes components. And what they found is that users were confused and mistakes were getting made out in the field. So were we able to come up with a Page Field Configurator solution that worked for them? Yes, we were actually. The solution was pretty extensive. We used almost all of the field configuration options to adjust almost 200 fields across 3 components. So it's actually a pretty big configuration effort. However, I do want to mention that they didn't have a need for the multiple sequences of configuration or sequence criteria. So while we did do a lot of field adjustment, we didn't use the multiple sequences or the criteria. However, those are features that are included in Page Field Configurator. So here are some quick examples. This is an example of the Course Catalog Offerings tab before any field changes were made. And this is what it looked like after. Still a pretty busy page. But what you can see is that there's 3 tabs hidden across the top. And then there's a lot more fields that were disabled or display only. And then several other non-essential checkboxes were hidden. And then finally, this entire taxonomy group box is hidden. Here's another example. This is the course catalog components tab. And then after, you'll notice that most of the fields are hidden, and the result here ended up to be a lot of white space, and for some reason, the scroll area doesn't hide, even though, so this course attendance scroll area doesn't hide even though all the fields within it are hidden. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then one more example, this is the class meetings tab. This is a very busy page, and while there are lots of features that are hidden, it's a little harder to tell. So while on the components page in the previous slide, we saw lots of white space when fields are hidden, look closely at the meeting pattern scroll. Meeting pattern scroll is here. I hid the topics field, and fortunately on the alternate display, that area actually resizes. But again, with within the greater section scroll here at the top, the room characteristics and academic shift grids are simply empty. So room characteristics, even though we removed all the fields, and academic shift, we removed all the fields, the grids remain, even though they're empty and there's nothing you can actually do in them. In the end, we found that department users were not sensitive to these issues, and it still provided a more streamlined experience, so they approved it, and it's in use today. In summary, there are a lot of really positive aspects of this tool, so let's talk about what those are. Firstly, it's really easy to get up and running. Add component to Page and Field Configurator, and all the tabs and fields become available to adjust, including any of your custom pages that are already in the registry. It is very straightforward clicking between component pages to make changes or to choose fields for adjusting. It's straightforward to create multiple views of the same component using sequences. Straightforward to control the users who should see each view. In fact, they added new functionality for that this year. And easy push button event mapping directly on the Page and Field Configurator tool. So you as a functional user can click a button and map all of those changes to events right away without yourself. Now it's not perfect. One thing that we found was that fields need to be adjusted, or fields to be adjusted need to be added one at a time. At least that's the way it is currently. That is probably one of the best features that's in the roadmap to improve this tool is the ability to multi-select fields when you're trying to add them to the adjustment grid. And then you'll need to apply configuration to the event mapping framework before you actually see any changes. So that can be a tough one to remember, is that not only do you have to apply configuration to event mapping before you can test your solution, but then if you go through multiple iterations of configuration, you need to reapply event mapping to make sure that you don't miss any events. And then finally, you will have to determine if your users are sensitive to these cosmetic issues when hiding a lot of fields on the page. So one thing that we noticed is that if a page has a lot of description fields, and this is just one example, in the course catalog, there are 5 different description fields, and you kind of have to, you have to know which one you're looking for. You have to hide a description field if you hide a prompt, if you hide its associated prompt field. Then there's a ton, you run the potential of creating a lot of white space and empty grids. You'll just have to determine that for yourself as you hide more and more fields, whether or not the white space created on the page is a stopper. And then the other thing is that be aware that field change events are not accommodated. So while other kind of event mapping is available, field change events are not. There are some improvements in the pipeline. So this slide shows you what was delivered in 2019 and what's expected to be delivered in 2020. I encourage you to go to the RECONNECT session where they rolled out the Page and Field Configurator roadmap, and they'll go over the improvements that are in the pipeline in greater detail for you. So finally, how do you decide whether Page and Field Configurator is right for your project before investing a ton of time and effort in actually building out a solution? Well, these are some of the recommendations that we have. If you find that the target component already handles the needed transactions, you won't be able to add fields that aren't already there. So Page and Field Configurator is right for you if the component already does what it needs to do. It doesn't allow for additional customization by adding additional fields. Page and Field Configurator is right for you if the component pages have one or more fields that aren't useful. You can streamline user experience for specific user groups, which is handy. If the component is useful, but field labels don't match your terminology, That's easy to solve with Page and Field Configurator. When users for alternate views can be determined using PS roles or combinations of field criteria. So if you can identify a user or a user group with a PeopleSoft role and make those configurations applicable to all people in that role, then this is a good tool. And then finally, if your users aren't fussy about page aesthetics, like we said, white space and empty grids, then this could be a good tool for you. If your project has any of these requirements, though, you might want to consider passing. So if you need new custom fields on a page, Page and Field Configurator can't do that for you. If you need to break app designer rules, such as unrequire required fields, or make already display only fields editable, or unhide currently hidden fields, Page and Field Configurator can't do that for you. If you need to rearrange fields on the page or rearrange pages within the component, can't do that. And if what you really need to do is build security, i.e. if your goal is just making an entire page display only, consider using the PeopleSoft security options for that as a more efficient method. And then finally, if you have very specific conditional functionality. So if what you're trying to do is conditionally hide a scroll area or filter a dropdown on prompt tables or dynamically default field values or add workflow to a page, Page and Field Configurator can't do any of those things either. And finally, I encourage you to learn more. I think almost any organization will eventually find some use for this feature. But as you evaluate Page and Field Configurator, remember that configuration can be applied to registered components only. Secondary pages and other modal windows can only use the Page and Field Configurator if they have the newer versions of PeopleTools installed. Configurations still require maintenance and migration, so especially conditional and user list specific roles. So when you create your configuration, you'll need to have someone on your team that can use that data migration workbench in order to move your configuration up the production path. And configuration must often be applied on multiple components where the same pages and fields appear. So if you're an HCM user using both add a job component or, the add a job as well as maintain a job, those are two separate components. And if you're trying to streamline the experience across those components, then you'll need to make the same field adjustments on both of those components. And then lastly here at the bottom of the slide, we included a couple of links. I found these training materials really handy when I was learning this tool. So there's a really good YouTube video there at the last bullet point. And then, of course, we have some Oracle documentation about using Page and Field Configurator, a little bit more official advice there. So I think that about wraps up my time. I'd certainly like to know if anybody on the call has tried Page and Field Configurator at their organization, either on a complex solution or a simple solution.
Margaret, can you hear me?
I can. Is that Praveen?
Yes. So I think I posted a question also on the chat. So do you recommend or move every changes in the Page and Field Configurator through data migration workbench?
I do recommend it. It's not necessarily simple, but if you don't move it through data migration workbench, then you simply have to recreate the configuration in every test environment as you move up the production chain or the production path.
Yeah.
We did actually have to do that the first time that this moved to production, we did actually have to do that because when you use data migration workbench, there's definitely a technical element to that, and you have to have some file servers set up. So somebody is now saying they had major issues migrating between environments. Unfortunately, I can't give you any advice about the ADS tool, and I can reiterate that when we moved to production, someone on the team did actually have to recreate all of the configuration in production. So
Yeah, because we tried data migration workbench few years back, and we wanted to make it standard for moving all the configuration changes whenever we do any config changes in the system. And we came across so many bugs and gaps that we gave up. We said we cannot make it as a standard for everything. It has so many loopholes and limitations. So that's why I was curious to know if it is working really well now or not.
I'd be curious to know if anybody has, I know we heard on the chat that somebody else had the same difficulty that we had. I think that the only thing I can really tell you about ADS really is that they deliver the pieces that you need to migrate Page and Field Configurator projects, but we at the time that we used it, I didn't actually get to see it happen. So I can't say one way or the other whether it would have worked in the future, but at the time frame we needed to get it production, it did not.
Okay, yeah, and the second question I have is, and again we have just started using it for a few things, and we also came across an issue where you cannot use a page and field configurator unless you have the access to the underlying component. So yeah, so and in our case it's challenging because if IT owns the page and field configurator changes, and if functional owns the access to the component, it doesn't work that way for us. So that's another big limitation. And I think we opened a Oracle SR also. I'm not sure, they said working as designed, I believe, but not sure if you came across this issue and what do you do in such cases? Or
That's a great question. We fortunately didn't come across that issue, and the reason why is because the work that we did with Page and Field Configurator was done by a business analyst in the ID department. So by default, I had access to the underlying components. So I know that in the RECONNECT session where they did the PFC roadmap, that topic did come up where it was a poll question where the Oracle folks asked users, who do they delegate control of the Page and Field Configurator to? So I think that's just an organizational question, right? Like who's going to be responsible for making the configuration changes?
Yeah, but tying it to a component in a big picture doesn't make sense, because unless I have access to the page field configurator, I cannot make a change itself, So
yeah,
why
no, I agree.
Security because if IT has to manage, he will get the access to the page field configurator. If business has to manage, they can get the access to that page. So it was just.
I agree with you. I wouldn't have expected that. I wouldn't have expected that, Praveen. That is surprising.
So that's another thing here, and also in the case by case basis, we have seen that in some pages it allows you to do things like hide and stuff, but in some pages it doesn't come up. I'm not sure what kind of limitations or checks system performs that in some pages you can do this stuff, in some not. Like, is it dependent on whether something is a work record field that you can't hide? Because recently we got a request to hide in few pages, and in some we can, in some it doesn't even allow us to do that. It doesn't becomes available. So there are both kind of limitations also we are seeing.
Yeah, I'm not surprised about that, because we did find that because it doesn't impact field changes, there were some occasions where a field, where like a checkbox controlled whether or not another field on the component shows up. So it was difficult so we wouldn't be able to control the behavior of that field, because the behavior of that field was governed by the field change event. And so Page and Field Configurator wouldn't work on the field that was governed by the field change event. So yeah, we did run into something like that.
Okay. Thank you.